The advent of compilation Final Fantasy VII in the mid-2000s has long since embellished and obfuscated impressions of the original game released in 1997 in both sequelizing and prequelizing the events surrounding the core story of Meteorfall. Characters like Zack Fair and the Turks have become further embellished, and the game has stretched into a sprawling anthology that was among the first in the series to break away from Hironobu Sakaguchi's original vision of the titles being standalone entries. However, what the compilation material also did was definitively clarify the fallout of an otherwise ambiguous, potentially morbid conclusion of Final Fantasy VII proper. So here we consider the pros and cons of Final Fantasy sequels. What have they historically done for the titles they followed on from, and what benefits do they serve in the stories they seek to extend or conclude? Jumping right in and keeping first with Final Fantasy VII, looking to the original ending of the game, we had a dramatic FMV of our team escaping the northern crater. Meteor is about to make an impact with the planet, and Aerith, who has become one with the lifestream, summons Holy in a dramatic act of Deus Ex Machina to try and stop it. The twist is that Holy in fact fails to stop Meteor, and as Midgar begins to crumble, the lifestream bursts forth from the planet, enveloping Meteor in the atmosphere as the game ends. Adding to the ambiguity of this ending is a post-credits scene set 500 years later, showing Red 13 and his progeny looking down on the ruins of Midgar, which has been reclaimed by nature. So there was definitely no clear-cut ending here back in 1997. And indeed, Yoshinori Kitase did make a passing comment a few years later, saying that he considered Final Fantasy VII a happy ending despite the destruction of humanity. And regardless of Kitase's opinion of it, there was plenty of conversation at the time, players speculating in forums whether or not everyone died, whether or not the party died, and whether the wider world beyond Midgar survived. For my part, the post-credits scene always seemed to have some very clear symbolism about it, the planet returning to be one with nature without the destructive element of humans being included, and these are the sorts of Studio Ghibli-esque themes that pull through in several Final Fantasy games, and particularly Final Fantasy VII quite heavily, where we have this science and technology versus nature debate playing out very subtly through the course of the game. So, jumping forward, the release of Advent Children, and later Dirge of Cerberus, upended many prevailing theories by showing not only that humanity survived, but also that Cloud and his friends survived. For its part, Advent Children was something of a flashy tech demo for the time, showcasing Cloud and Tifa in some pretty cool fight scenes in what was then cutting-edge technology. But otherwise, it was actually quite lean on story or narrative progression, and veered instead into dealing with very subtle, quiet character portraits, hinging mostly around Cloud's post-trauma isolation and efforts of his friends to try and reconcile with him. So whether or not Advent Children needed to exist is really up for debate. It didn't really move the dial for the overall story of Final Fantasy VII, though it probably made the Turks and Rufus a bit more popular in their new anti-villain guise. It showcased some cool action sequences, as I say, but largely dissenters of the film have pointed to it as evidence of the newly merged Square Enix cashing in on their flagship IP and their flagship hero of Cloud Strife in an effort to generate profits. For my part, given the choice, I liked the ambiguous ending of Final Fantasy VII proper, because that's what I think creates conversation and legacy, and I think a lot of audiences love a cliffhanger because it's something to debate for eternity. But equally, aside from decisively telling us what happened next, I find Advent Children really quite inoffensive. It didn't really do anything wrong. It didn't corrupt legacy characters by giving them stupid story arcs, and indeed I think it quite purposefully sparingly showed our characters. It showed just enough of Vincent, just enough of Cloud, just enough of Rufus to hype up the fandom without diminishing these respective characters. The fight scenes were great for the time, and the soundtrack was great, with additions of the death metal version of One Winged Angel and classic piano pieces like The Haunting for the Reunion. Moving on to probably the next most significant Final Fantasy sequel, we have Final Fantasy X. Now, much like Final Fantasy VII, the pre-sequel Final Fantasy X ending and the short window of time before its sequel's existence painted a much bleaker picture of what the ending and the world looked like here. In one of the more momentous, tear-jerking endings of the series, the lovers of Tidus and Yuna, whose romance had blossomed and built up over the course of the game, are torn apart in dramatic Shakespearean fashion as the faith's dreaming ceases and Tidus disappears as Yuna weeps and laments his loss. It was an extremely powerful moment and ending for a game that bookended Squaresoft's tenure as the sole proprietors of the Final Fantasy series. And again, at the time, it received a highly emotional and speculative response from players across forums and Final Fantasy communities. So, unlike the window of time between Final Fantasy VII and Advent Children, Final Fantasy X-2 released just 2 years later, and unlike the conscious narrative reserve of Advent Children, it really sought to push the game, push the characters in a new direction, with the survivors and most specifically Yuna's character. And indeed, rather than wallowing in the tragedy of the first game's conclusion, the world of Final Fantasy X-2 sought to explore the setting of a world liberated from sin. For her part, Yuna has evolved into a sphere hunter / J-pop star in a weird turn of events, and the game follows her search to resurrect Tidus and reconcile with her lost love. Again, this had a mixed reception at release, and I'd venture to say that it was much more controversially received than any Final Fantasy VII material, owing to the light-hearted all-girl adventure that was much more action-orientated, much more optimistic, and again, arguably diminished the tragedy and the fallout of the first game. For my part, I don't think Final Fantasy X-2 needed to exist, but by the same token, it's not a game that I hate, it's not a game that I take too seriously, and I don't think it's a game that wants to be taken seriously either. So these are two examples of where big name titles in the Final Fantasy series have, if not contradicted their original endings, then certainly upended the impression left by the original titles. It is perhaps Square shying away from ambiguity, shying away from tragedy in favour of fan service, or as the more vocal critics would suggest, in search of profits from their big name titles. And I suppose the question remains as to whether players enjoy this sort of clarity and continuity, whether they enjoy the swerve away from ambiguity in favour of seeing these characters again. And indeed, part of the reason I rate Final Fantasy XVI, and more so the contentiously received Final Fantasy XV, is that for the first time in a long time, Square refused to shy away from conclusive tragic endings. The plight of Noctis, the relentless and successive losses of his father, his betrothed, his kingdom, and ultimately his life over the course of FF15, is a great example of a self-contained arc. And while 15 is certainly not without its faults, certainly with its storytelling, Noctis at least has a very definitive beginning, middle and end, and unlike Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy XIII, there is no lingering scope to bolt on additions and sequels and try to spin a new yarn to a tale that many players might not need.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon, or if you'd like to buy me a coffee, you can do so, the links are available below.